Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody had a great night. We've got a terrific morning planned for you, and I'm going to take the opportunity just to provide a quick little oversight of why we're here, and then I'm going to introduce our mayor. The thinking behind this morning's panel had to do with a lot of discussions that we've been having about musicians and the state of our community at Music Canada when we talk about this. And when I think back to over the last 15 years, one of the things that resonates with me is that there was a very explicit promise made at the outset of our digital revolution. And that promise was heard from pundits and the technophiles and the journalists and the media and the politicians. Everybody was saying one thing, that whatever happened, record companies are going to disappear, this, that, and the other thing is going to happen, there's going to be some kind of utopian environment, but that the artists would be okay, that the creators would be taken care of. That was repeated so many times that I believe it actually has taken on the force of a social contract. And I believe, and I think you're going to hear a little bit about this morning, I think it's a social contract that has been broken. And we have to do something about that. So we're going to start thinking about what we're going to do about that today. I'm now going to introduce our mayor, and you know, it's in keeping with that theme, cities can actually be part of the answer. Now, I think years ago, nobody would have said that. Nobody would have thought that cities have a role to play in this new environment. But we believe that they can act as incubators and can stimulate activity in the music sector through policies and engagement. In early June, Music Canada is going to be releasing a global study on music cities that will highlight some of the best practices from cities around the world. We've invited Mayor Tory to participate in this on account of his great leadership in our community. So, Mayor Tory, if I could have you come up to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Graham, thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And I realize you had hopefully a fun night last night, and some of you may be just getting some of that greasy food you have to get in you in order to recover from that. I want to particularly welcome the people who are here from outside of Toronto, and just to say that we welcome you to Canadian Music Week. We welcome you to Toronto, and hope you've had a good time while you were here. I've met a number of people from Australia, which of course is the country of focused attention this year. And I met a large group from Atlanta yesterday. There were 100 people here from Atlanta sort of looking at Toronto and trying to figure out how we do some of the things we do here. And I did draw to their attention, because I think it's only fair that you should disclose these kinds of things to visitors, that there's a little known bylaw that you won't know about. It's bylaw 762, and in particular section 34B, which says that when you leave Toronto, it's an unusual provision that doesn't exist very many places, they inspect your bags leaving town. Because we're trying to make sure you've done enough shopping while you're here. And so I just want to make sure you know that when you get to the airport to leave, you'll have your bags inspected, and if there isn't enough stuff in there that you bought here, you'll be sent back downtown for a remedial session. I'm here today because this is an important event in the life of the city, and it's an important event for the Canadian music industry. And I sought the office that I now hold. I've had it only for 5 months, saying that music was something that I believed was important to the city in many different respects. And I've tried to show that I was serious about that since I've held the office. For example, the first trip I took outside of Toronto to try and do something that was aimed at building up the city was to Austin, to go there. And I went there to see two things. One, I went to see how South by Southwest was put on and how it had grown to be so big and so successful. But secondly, I went there to satisfy myself by actual meetings with companies that were not limited to the technology business, but largely focused on the technology business, and global companies that sought to invest in Austin, which wouldn't necessarily have struck many people as the place they would have ended up in the United States, but they have. And I found there that, of course, in terms of the putting on of the festival, that we had a lot of work to do here in terms of being a welcoming place for a music festival in every respect, and I'll refer to a couple of the granular aspects of that in a moment. But I also found what you know to be true and what I think I knew to be true, but I heard it firsthand from those companies like IBM and Google and others, that they located in Austin with all the jobs that they brought with them because of the vibrant music scene, because that music scene attracted the kind of people that they needed to hire, and that there was a kind of a connection of the dots that came together there. And so it underlines something that you know to be true, and that I know to be true in a more abstract way, but that it is going to be beneficial not just to the cultural well-being, not just to the soul of the city of Toronto to have a much higher profile, much more vibrant music industry in this city, but it's going to be good for the economy, and it's good for the economy in at least two ways. First, of course, the direct jobs, and I don't think a lot of people focus on how many people work in one aspect or another of this industry in this city. But secondly, because it is a fundamental part of our attracting to this city other companies that may have no connection to music directly whatsoever, but have a lot of a connection to a city that has a passion for the creative arts generally and for music in particular. And so I'm here, I guess I'm telling you things you know, but I guess maybe it's more important that I should stand up here and tell you that I recognize this, and that my first trip out of the country was, on behalf of Toronto, was to go and see South by Southwest and to learn from it. And it was to go and make sure that I understood completely the connection that does exist between a strong, vibrant music industry and music presence in the city and the overall health of the city in terms of its soul, but also in terms of its economy. And I should tell you that I owe a special word of thanks to Mike Tanner, because he was the one that had the great patience to take me around. I mean, he can take credit, it will be in my book, that he introduced me to hip-hop. I mean, look, I'm a 60-year-old grandfather, for God's sake. I mean, my grandkids and my kids all, like hip-hop, and I didn't dislike it. I had no exposure to it. It wouldn't have been something that would have been a part of the frame of my life. I mean, I thought Neil Young was terrific, and I still do, and assorted other artists like of that sort of particular vintage. But Mike introduced me to hip-hop. I'll be forever grateful. I enjoyed it, as you would, immensely, and I saw some of the Canadian artists that we were proud to see featured down at South by Southwest. I'll just say to you that I also ran on a platform, and I'm not trying to rehash an election campaign, you're not interested, but I ran on a platform of bringing Toronto together, because Toronto was very divided by a lot of the events of the last period of time. And Toronto faces a special challenge, because it is probably the single most diverse city in the world. And so we have people here, 50% of the people who live in this city were born outside the country, which is a high in the whole world. There is no other place like that. And so if you think about ways in which you can bring people together, what way is going to serve that purpose better than the arts, and in particular music? It is a universal language. It is a unifier around the world. It's an educator, it's an entertainer, it's an employer. And so in that sense, one of the reasons why I picked music quite deliberately to talk about as part of what I wanted to do if I was lucky enough to become the mayor of the city, was because it can serve all of those purposes. And if you're trying to bring the city together and have that soul that is understood by everybody, no matter where they came from, the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, their religion, their this, their that, then you know that music is one of the things that can do that. For the government of the city, trying to sort of make this happen rests in much more practical things that we can do. And I just want you to know that I'm also beginning to get, after a relatively short period of time in office, the kinds of things that we're going to have to do. Obviously, money is an important part of that. And, I'm going to say something that all governments say, which is we're limited in our ability to just sort of say, well, look, let's double the amount that we're investing. But we're going to find new ways. For example, I'm even restoring something that was called a Mayor's Evening for the Arts, which raised a 7-figure sum of money, which went right directly to the arts. And it's just an event that I put on as the mayor, and it hasn't been done for a number of years. We're doing it this year in the fall. And so that's going to produce a 7-figure sum, which is going to go to support some aspect of the arts. And if you don't think that I'm going to try and direct some of it to music, because it was something that I spoke about when I was contesting this office, then you'd be wrong about that. But I think a lot of it has to do with, as well, helping artists. Because at the end of the day, yes, there are all the people that are involved in the business of music, but none of it happens. There is no business without the artists. And so just so you know that we're not sort of ignoring these kinds of things, we just approved about 10 days ago, for example, a development which I think is going to be unique, although not the first of its kind in Toronto, up in sort of the northwestern part of the city, where as part of a community hub, we actually have, I think, built in there, I'm going from memory on the name, 25 housing units set aside for artists as affordable housing, but they're set aside for artists so that artists can have a place to live on an affordable basis in the city, because we need them to live here and to be here to earn a living. And I know it's hard. I'm seized of the fact that my own view about getting the traffic moving and not closing all the streets at once ran up against the Young Dundas Square concert of the Canada Music Week last weekend. And this year, what I've just said this morning is we're going to get that date on the calendar early so that it becomes the first thing that's going to have a street closed and not the thing that came up sort of last. Because I did say we were going to limit the number of street closures we're going to have at any one time because the city was becoming paralyzed, as great as all these events were. We're going to deal with the issue of venues and the fact that as we increasingly intensify development in the downtown core, it comes up against music venues, and we've got to decide that there are going to be places where music is going to be played, and it's an important part of our city and its soul and its economy, and we're going to make sure that we do our planning in such a way as to sort of try to limit the number of these kinds of conflicts that come up. I'm going to be an advocate on things like even income smoothing, because I understand the fact that an artist's income, whether it be musical or otherwise, can be very variable, and that you've got to have things that happen through the other government's good graces with the tax provisions to make sure that there's special accommodation made for that. And I discovered something yesterday that should be a good news story. I was told yesterday that we, through all the events that are being put on as part of the Pan Am Games that are happening here in July and August, and the Parapan Games, have funded all kinds of little festivals that are going to happen across the city, which has meant a whole bunch of artists have been hired to perform. That's the local artists. That's the good news. If you would think, why would there be any bad news out of this? Well, when the regular festivals that happen year after year after year have gone to get some of those artists to play, they have clauses in their contracts that deal with the radius within which they can't perform during a given period of time. Well, there's no reason for that, and I'm going to seek, with the help of my good friend Mike Tanner, to see if we can't convince, it's our money that went into the Pan Am Games, and say, look, we can waive those clauses so they can play for Pan Am Games, which is not a profit-making venture, and play for the festivals, which are not profit-making ventures, and have 2 gigs instead of 1. And these are the kinds of things where I wouldn't know about this if somebody hadn't brought it to my attention. I'm talking about instituting something at our, either the Sony Center or somewhere else, that's like the Live at Lincoln Center thing, where you take a Toronto artist and put them on stage, bring all their friends in from around the world that know them, and have a great thing we can televise here. We've never really done anything like that, where we've celebrated our own artists as the Americans are so good at doing. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to do with a view to sort of putting some money where our mouth is, and trying to make sure that we stand behind making this a music city for real, not just in words. I noticed in Austin they had these T-shirts that said "Keep Austin Weird," and I thought that was, kind of a good way of kind of encapsulating, in some respects, a city that is committed to more than just doing business and just having transit to get around and so on. Those are all important things. I don't know whether we shouldn't have a few T-shirts that say "Make Toronto Sing," because we should make sure that we bring to the attention of people how important music and the creative arts are to the life of this city, because it is at the root of attracting the best and the brightest to our city. It is at the root of bringing the city together and making sure it can discover its own soul. And it's at the root of making sure that we can be seen as a center of innovation, a center that embraces people who are creative and innovative. And so I want to just conclude by saying congratulations to all the people involved with the Canadian Music Week and every part of what's happened over the course of the past week. And to commit to you, I'll have more of a running start for next year's event, because I just got to office this year. A lot of the planning was done. So we'll work together with Canadian Music Week to make sure we animate, for example, that square across the street. That square across the street, which is the city's #1 square, Young Dundas is probably tied for first, but it's great. It was animated. We'll get that street closed for the thing next year, but we'll have something going on here, right outside our iconic City Hall, so that we have more places to engage more people. And I promise you, if I have a 1-year running start at making sure that kind of stuff happens, together with all the other things I've mentioned, we'll be able to stand here next year and say we've made great progress on raising the profile of music in this city, which is going to do so much good for so many. Thanks very much.
Could I get Neil to come up? We have a presentation for you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Graham. I'm pleased to be here today to present an inaugural award that is created for a way for the global festival industry to recognize positive local environments for festivals and events worldwide. We have more than 40 festivals in attendance at CMW this year, participating in the conference and checking out bands every night in this city. Festivals and events create tremendous community, economic capital in the markets they serve. But the partnership and support from the local community is critical to the success of existing festivals and events, as well as the ability to attract and encourage new events. Through this special award, CMW is pleased to recognize those cities and markets that have worked through a concerted effort to provide environmental, conducive, successful festivals and events. Today, we'd like to present the very first International Festival City of the Year Award to the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory.
May I just say that clearly, after 5 months in office, I would have had nothing to do with the fact we won this award. But I'm learning how to be a good politician, and I'll take all the credit for it anyway, and just say thank you on behalf of Toronto, and we're going to do better to make sure we earn this honor in every single respect on an ongoing basis. Thank you very much.
All right, let's get on with our panel now, and I'll ask the panelists to come up, Scott, Blake, Zoe, and Kate. I'll introduce Kate. Kate is probably well known to most folks in this room. She's a journalist, critic, novelist who covers arts for the Globe and Mail. She currently writes a twice-weekly column at globeandmail.com about cultural issues, including policy, copyright, and technology. We're big fans of her at Music Canada. In 2009-10, she was awarded the Atkinson Fellowship to study Canadian cultural sovereignty in the digital age, publishing the results in the Toronto Star. Her 2003 novel, Madame Proust and the Kosher Kitchen, won a Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book and the Toronto Book Award. She wrote a second novel, A Man in Uniform. It was published in 2010, and she's currently working on another. So with that, Kate, please take it away.
Thanks, Graham. So welcome everyone to Canadian Music Week's annual Global Forum Networking Breakfast. It's such an honor for me to be here because over the years I've sat in on a lot of really provocative and informative discussions at Canadian Music Week. It's always a highlight of my year. And so my goal this morning is that we reach that same high standard. So for at least a decade, we've heard about the importance of the creative class. It's essential to the growth of the city, as the mayor was talking about, to the growth of business, to the growth even of regions. Cities that don't attract a creative class are going to fail, we're told. But maybe somewhere in there we've forgotten the fundamentals of survival. What is the point of a city working to attract the creative class if members of that class can no longer make a living in their chosen fields? So that's our topic this morning. And following our panel discussion, we'll have a bit of time for questions and answers from the delegates. And then afterwards, you'll all take part in the breakfast roundtables moderated by a facilitator sitting at each table. And at the end, delegates are asked to please all fill out a brief questionnaire. So, for the purposes of tweeting or blogging or posting or writing things on your hands, you can consider that our panel and the Q&A are on the record. However, once we go to the tabletop afterwards, those sessions will be held under what's called the Chatham House Rule. And don't be embarrassed if you haven't heard of the Chatham House Rule, because I found out what it is yesterday. So here's what it is. When a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House Rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any participant may be revealed. So the point of the Global Forum is to encourage frank discussion amongst the participants, and the delegate survey that you'll be filling out helps to define the industry viewpoint about the issue being discussed. So to ensure that candid discussion, the comments and deliberations on the tabletops will be confidential, and that includes blogs, tweetings, and any posting. But meanwhile, our panel discussion and the Q&A will be filmed and posted on Music Canada's website, which is musiccanada.com. So, without any more rules and regulations, let me introduce our panel in the order they're sitting here. I'm sure you know New York recording artist and record producer Blake Morgan because he is, of course, the man behind I Respect Music. In the 1990s, Blake had released the critically acclaimed Anger's Candy as part of a 7-album contract with N2K Sony when he decided the old model was too precarious. He was a prescient man. He quit and established ECR Music Group, which operates on the unprecedented principle that all of its artists and labels own 100% of their master recording. In 2013, an op-ed that Blake wrote for the Huffington Post went viral, and the I Respect Music campaign was born. Blake has successfully challenged Pandora on the issue of performers' rights on radio, and I Respect Music continues to grow, supported by everyone from Patrick Stewart and Jane Fonda to the rock stars at the US Copyright Office. And next we have Canadian-born cellist and music activist Zoë Keating, who I've just found out is a native of Guelph, Ontario. She's also a one-woman orchestra. She's known for the innovative way in which she samples her own playing live on stage with a foot-controlled laptop. She's also an innovator on the business side, taking a grassroots, label-free approach to recording and releasing her music. In 2011, she was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. As a cellist based in Northern California, Zoë has played with Imogen Heap, Amanda Palmer, Tears for Fears, DJ Shadow, Dan Hicks, Thomas Dolby, John Vanderslice, Rasputina, Pamplemousse, and Paolo Nutini. She also regularly composes for film and television, and she'll be playing tonight, 8:30, Church of the Holy Trinity. That's the church next to the Eaton Center. And so I like to think of our first two panelists as kind of warriors in the trenches of the music industry. And we also, thankfully, have a war correspondent with us. Scott Timberg is a Los Angeles cultural journalist, blogger, and author. A former arts writer for the LA Times, he's also contributed to the New York Times and GQ, and just recently he signed on as a staff writer with Salon. He's co-editor of The Misread City, New Literary Los Angeles, and very important for our purposes today, he's just published Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. So, without further ado, we'll move to the panel. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to say a little bit about sort of their perspective on our topic, and then I have some questions for you. So Blake, do you want to start? Tell us a bit about I Respect Music.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's really great to be here again. I love the introduction because it makes it sound like I was really smart back in the day, and I wasn't. I was just really desperate, but that's okay. But I was here last year. I don't know how many of you were here last year when I spoke, but I was really just beginning to introduce the I Respect Music campaign, and it's amazing to be here a year later. I'm really grateful to be here. But how much things have changed in just a year. The campaign has grown, and tens of thousands of people stepping up and standing up for what they do, music makers and music lovers together for this campaign, and the spirit and hope and energy and righteous anger that I think we're probably here to talk about today. All of these factors in the campaign have scored huge victories for music makers and music lovers, and it's swept me onto Capitol Hill so that I could actually deliver the signatures of our petition to our leaders and talk to our representatives unfiltered. And my own representative, Congressman Nadler, just introduced the Fair Play, Fair Pay Act of 2015, which we're very excited about, which speaks to the central issue that I Respect Music really began about, which is artists pay for radio airplay. The United States is the only democratic country in the world where artists don't get paid for radio airplay. So to see movement on this issue based on everyday working musicians and music lovers standing together has been unprecedented and incredible and inspiring. So in just 1 year, we've seen this happen. And it's a very tough climate, and there's a lot of fight ahead, but it's also possible to have two feelings at the same time, which is we have a lot to fight about, but also to celebrate the victories that we've had over this last year and the energy and the newfound spirit that we actually have to work with.
Great, thank you very much, Blake. Zoe, do you want to take it from there? My sense is your positions maybe, or your approaches are slightly different.
Well, one thing that often doesn't get in my bio is that I spent my 20s working in technology. I worked at a software startup in San Francisco when I first went out there. I was a data analyst and information architect. And so I actually happened to work with a lot of people who have gone on to be at Google and Facebook and what have you. And so I often feel like this discussion has become somewhat polarized, and I feel like I have a foot on both sides. And so I think that I do believe in the power of technology to kind of reduce inefficiencies. However, technology is made by people for people, and it's also true that money just flows to the path of least resistance. And I do believe that if it was not for regulation in nearly every industry, there wouldn't be any sort of, well, it would be a race to the bottom. And so I think that in music we need to think about, like, does it have to be true that disruption leads a lot of casualties along the way? Or is there anything that can be done to kind of stabilize things? And I'm not really, I know that all of my libertarian technologist friends will yell, screaming from the room, at the notion of regulation as having any role. But I think it's something to think about. And then the other thing is that I think what's really missing is sort of this sense that I do think that technology can still help. I think that it's not enough to mobilize people to want to do the right thing if there's no way for them to do that. And that's the piece that I think that I've been a little out of the discussion for the last year because my husband was very ill. But sort of diving back into this, I think where I would like to see some efforts focused is on sort of thinking of how we can create the technology that might help. I think there are some things to be done, and that's what we should think. And to engage people in Silicon Valley to help us solve those problems and see, are there ways that they can help do that in a financial way that benefits them and us. So.
Good. Well, I think we'll want to hear more about that as we go along. But first, let's hear Scott. Maybe you have a little bit of a bird's eye view for us.
Yeah. It's exciting for me to be here in Canada, even if this is earlier. I'm from California, earlier than I'm normally even awake, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit. But I'm pleased to be in Canada for a couple reasons. First of all, even as Americans, we love artists like Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, the band, Ron Sexsmith, Sloan. There are so many great Canadian musicians over the years. But Canada is also, if we sort of pull the camera back just from the lives of musicians, Canada is, I think I'm right here, a country that had no banks collapse during the financial crisis, and that also, I think, now has the largest middle class in the world, or at least one of the rare middle classes in the developed world that's growing rather than shrinking and sort of, running for the hills. So this may seem kind of tangential to a music conference, but the economic kind of basis, foundation of a musician's life, or an artist's life, or a novelist's life, a journalist's life, graphic designer, somebody who works in a record store, somebody who works as a clerk at a bookstore. All of these people are members of the creative class, and while we heard a lot of hype and magical thinking about what the creative class would do to our cities and how we'd have bike lanes and more coffee shops and stuff, all of which I'm in favor of, we didn't really pay attention to what was happening to artists and to actual creators within the creative class and the people who helped them get their work to market. Again, the record store clerks, the music journalists, the people along the way. These people were allowed to sort of fall down the chute. Again, I don't know the scene here in Canada. I know that in the US, it's true in the UK as well, the sort of really virulently neoliberal countries where we assume that capitalism, the market, will take care of everything. The creative class was allowed to dangle a bit. And that's what my book, which is called Culture Crash, is very much about that. It's about the musician at the center of things, but also the other people who help make a musician's work, or an artist's work, or a novelist's work happen. So that's the frame that I look at all of this through. The last thing I'll say, I was cheered that the mayor talked about the importance of music to cities. Cities have been important, obviously, to the growth of music. And there's a chapter in my book, the one happy chapter in my book, which is called, I think it's called When Culture Works, which looks at Austin. I look at two other cities, but one of them is Austin in the 70s, and I look at how the music, not just the bands coming to Austin and people like Willie Nelson, but the whole infrastructure that made the Austin, the alt country scene of the 70s happen, and then South by Southwest and the whole kind of explosion of Austin as a great music capital. So anyway, that's my point of view on this.
Thank you. I wondered if we could turn first of all to that technology issue that Zoe's raised here. When I'm feeling really sort of self-confident and brave, I go out and take a look at what sort of the internet advocacy community is saying. I'm often, quite taken aback by that. And I wondered how both Zoe and Blake, how you respond to that kind of sense there is out there that you can't stop technology, that it must be allowed to do what it can do.
Well, I would say that from my experience, nearly everything on the internet is the result of a lot of experiments. And that we tend to see things like, the products that Google has in their offerings, like we tend to see those as very like something with an agenda, and often they're just totally the result of an experiment. I came up against this with YouTube, like this. I think I wrote a little bit in January about how YouTube was creating this music service, but they didn't actually know that I existed in their system, and so I think it was a total surprise to them when I protested. So I don't think that things are inevitable. I think that we just need to have artists be more involved in things. It's just.
And Blake, your experience with Pandora, maybe you can talk a bit about that, because that's a good example of that, if maybe they just didn't know you existed.
Well, they do now. I think this question, technology is not the problem and it's not an enemy, and I've never met anyone who is mad at the internet. It's an apparatus, and it's one I really like. We were just talking about this. I was asked, after Taylor Swift pulled her catalog from Spotify, I was asked to go on CNN, and the anchor said, we were talking about this, and she said, well, isn't it just the future? And she said, you can't stop progress. It's like you invent the airplane and then you ask people to walk. And the bubble over my head wanted to say, what are you talking about? And very politely instead, what I said is, well, but this isn't about technology. This is about artists getting paid for their work. And there's always been technology, whether it's sheet music or papyrus or, but these are just, this isn't anything new. It's simply a new way of doing something very old, which is screwing artists out of getting paid for what they do. And the idea that it's actually innovative that Spotify and Pandora are doing something truly groundbreaking. They're actually doing something that Beethoven was up against. When I was a little kid, I read all of Beethoven's diaries because I thought it would help me be a better composer. I was going to be a classical pianist. And all of his diaries are about money. It's always like, Johann, 3 towns over, still hasn't paid me for that cantata I wrote. And if I don't get paid, I'm going to be evicted again for the 3rd time this year. And I wish I could just get some real work done, and I can't because I can't get paid. So it's really the same thing. And what I'd say about the voices on the internet is, I live in New York City, and there's always a few people at the end of any subway car that are really loud and smelly and crazy, and they get everyone's attention, and it's really distracting, and everyone else is kind of afraid to speak up. And I'm not saying that that's who these people are, but what I am saying is I think what Zoë was saying, which is it's our responsibility as artists to speak up just as loud and to make it clear that we're fighting for our profession. I personally don't think anything I do is more or less valuable than anything anybody else does, but it's my profession, and in a capitalist country, I should be paid for my work. And I do think that I've seen over the last year, which is something to celebrate, is that a lot of artists, inspired by like what Zoë did in January, have stopped wringing their hands and they've started rolling up their sleeves. And I do believe that all of this is going to change from the bottom up as we speak up and as we stand out. So.
Sorry, did you want to add something there?
I was just saying that I play at a lot of technology conferences and often, go do these sort of technology events. And people say to me that I'm the only musician they know. And it sounds incredible to us here, at an event like this, but it is often the case for me that I'll go to an event or I'll be, I'm in Silicon Valley and I am the only musician people know. And so as long as that's the case, it's going to be true that you're going to make a little product and you're going to think it's awesome because you're thinking about users or listeners, whatever. But, nobody talked to a musician about it. So that's all I'm saying.
If I was going to know one musician, by the way, it would totally be you. So in that regard, they've nailed it.
Victor. They picked a good one to know. I want to return to that point about the sort of public perception in a minute, but before we do sort of leave the technology issue, I want to ask Scott a bit sort of for the more maybe macro there. I mean, I know a couple of years ago I was here and I went back to my desk and wrote a big story about how, Spotify was going to save the world. And, streaming in the cloud, and that was going to do it.
You're probably not the only person who wrote that story.
Yes, and then, of course, we found out, no, this is just another, another Google and another Amazon. So, do you have any hope?
Well, that's a tough one. Let me be succinct. When I turned my book in at the end of 2013, like any author, I had a fear that in the year or so before publication, the middle class would be saved, musicians would be dragged out of this sort of grand screwing they were getting by the technology companies, that bookstores would restore themselves in American and Canadian and English cities, and so on. What's interesting is that everything I described has gotten worse for the artists and the people who work in the arts. Some things have gotten better. In the US at least, the economy is a little better. Unemployment is improved. The one happy thing for artists, though, is I think that it's finally getting out to becoming clear, despite the sort of campaign of obfuscation coming from Silicon Valley telling us that we're in the best of all possible worlds, and that if you say that there are problems, that you're some kind of communist or a whiner or a pessimist or whatever kind of dismissive term they think of. But artists are starting to connect and to recognize something's wrong. They're starting to realize that the fact that a freelance writer or a musician or an artist paying more taxes than a hedge fund guy is wrong. The hedge fund guy does not pay less than you do because he is virtuous or because what he's doing for society is more constructive or productive. It's because they have advocacy, they give money to Washington politicians, they have lobbying groups in Washington or city of or London or whatever. Musicians and artists are starting to recognize the breadth of the problem, and because of that, they're starting to join hands a bit, form groups, go to Washington and other capitals. That's where my hope is, not that the system will spontaneously transform itself, not that the magic of the marketplace will save us or that technology will bring justice and equality, but rather that somebody, I think it was Blake, used the term righteous anger. If you leave this panel thinking everything's great and that you were entertained watching us, then we've really failed. What I have hope is that people who read my book, go to panels like this, listen to these people speak, recognize there's a problem and that we need to solve it. That's, I guess, where my sense of hope is.
So let's turn to that issue where really what it comes down to is a fight for public opinion, of course. And one thing for those of us who can remember back to the days of Napster, there was a real sort of public sense out there that, the music industry was getting what it deserved because they'd overcharged us for CDs. And that was a very kind of popular narrative you heard. And so I'm sort of wondering today, Zoe talked about money just following the easiest path. And consumers are always going to act in their immediate economic self-interest. If this version's $2 and that one's $5, well, I'll take the $2 version. So one thing I wanted to ask you all about is sort of how do we fight the public relations war?
I do think that one of the profound things that's changed over the last year, and again, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying, hey, things are awesome. I'm saying they're awesomer in a shit slide of disaster. But
That'll
again,
go on a T-shirt by the
yeah,
day's
that's my new. That's it. Hashtag that. That was terrific. But again, we're adults, and you can have two feelings at the same time. You can look at something that's dire. This is the, I'm an artist. I'm a musician. It's how I enter the world, and what I do and how I do it is not under threat. It's facing end of days. With that said, some of the things that would need to happen in order to fix this are happening, and the most moving one for me over the last year has been that when artists stand up in comparison to Napster and Lars Ulrich, who was right, by the way. I can say that in public now, and it's okay. So when an artist like Jan Arden stands up, when Zoë Keating stands up, when David Lowery stands up, there are hundreds of artists now. And with I Respect Music, of course, there are thousands and tens of thousands of artists who are playing in cover bands and wedding bands and local bands. And when they stand up and they speak out and they say, hey, Spotify, what are you doing? Hey, Pandora, what are you doing? Hey, National Association of Broadcasters, what are you doing? We have each other's backs now. Not in a small group, but in a gigantic group. And I don't see artists getting attacked in the same way that they used to. And by used to, I mean a year ago, like when I was here a year ago. So it's really changed, and that fosters change, because the more people step out and speak up, you know, what you did with YouTube in January is a sea change moment for artists. It's not too much to say that, it's too little to say that. It's a sea change moment for artists, and hundreds and thousands of artists had your back on Twitter and Facebook, and they will continue to, and that's something that's changed. You attack one of us, and you are gonna face all of us, and that was not the case a year ago.
I just wanted to jump in on something. I want to hear what you have to say too, but traditionally the art, you've gotten it, I agree with you, but you've gotten at some of the difficulty of this. I mean, traditionally artists, especially the kind of people who most of us in this room probably listen to, indie artists, artists on independent labels, or artists who see themselves as being independent-minded, whether the indie part is literal or just sort of a metaphor, it doesn't matter. Artists have for hundreds of years thought of themselves as being independent in all kinds of ways. In a sense, that's what I'm really a member of the audience. I'm a listener, I'm a reader, you know, a viewer of art. What we want from our artists traditionally has been some kind of independent mind, independent spirit, et cetera. That's part of the reason I think it's taken till now for artists to unify, and it's an old-fashioned kind of bohemian, to some extent French idea that artists need to exist in pure isolation from each other. I think it's an old sort of, it's not merely a myth, but it's a kind of accidental side effect, I guess I'd say, of the way artists have conceived of themselves. And this is why, again, groups where artists get together are important. You said something, too, about if you attack one of us, you attack all of us. I think the idea that artists and the larger creative community are on a team, and on a team that's besieged, that's in crisis, and that they need to work together is a crucial idea. And again, because of the sensibility of culture in the West, it's taken us a while to get there.
I would like to say, in terms of what could artists do, I don't think that artists have to come up and explain their theories on how they think capitalism works, you know, like, which, you know, some people think about that a lot. All an artist has to do is maybe say more often how their life works. Because I think that is a real mystery to nearly everybody who's not a musician. Just talk about your own personal experience, because that's what artists do, is they bring their experience of the world in a musical form to the audience, and then they hopefully touch people. You can still do that. Just tell people how your life works too. And I found early on that was actually very interesting to people. And I started talking about how I made a living as a totally independent artist. And that got way more traction than I expected, and I started publishing my earnings. So I just put online, like, this is how it works, this is how much money I make from ASCAP, this is how much money I make from CD sales, this is how much from physical, digital. And that ended up being a news story. Some independent cellist starts talking about her earnings, and it was news. So I think if everybody was to do that, we'd maybe get a critical mass of how diverse we are as a community. Because it's not just Beyonce, and it's not just struggling artists who want to be discovered. There's a whole range of kind of artists.
Yeah, there's that middle ground, which I think is what's really under threat.
So just talk about your personal experience and not turning it into a battle or a, like, you must do this, or you were, you know, just talk about your experience.
That is so important, and I think I said this last year. That's what I accidentally stumbled on, in some small degree, with I Respect Music. The magic word is I. It wasn't respect, and it wasn't music. I'm not telling you what you should do. I'm just going to tell you what I'm doing, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing, and I'm going to tell you also how I feel, which is another thing I've changed. Which is, it's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's people, we're standing up now, we're talking about how we feel. It's okay to say that, you know? And that was not the case, a year or two ago either. You know, and it's so true. I think just a short time ago in general, people outside the tent, outside of, you know, the expertise in this room and people who are so connected to this, they really did think, and far too many people still do, that there's, there are two kinds of musicians. There's Justin Timberlake and guys who are tending bar and working in cover bands. And the truth in music is the truth in any profession, which is that the middle class, which is what you were talking about, is the vast majority of who we are. And so some of the first meetings that I had on Capitol Hill, members of Congress were like, wait a minute, you have a mortgage? And I'm not busting on them. I'm like, yeah, dude, I have a mortgage, I didn't say dude, but I was like, dude, sir. But just that concept, like, wait a minute, you have housing payments and I was like, yeah, these shoelaces were paid for by musical ideas I had. And when the musical ideas work, I get more shoelaces. And when they don't, I wear sandals, I guess, something like that. But that's the humanization of what it is that we do. And that middle, that gigantic middle is so important.
Scott, you wanted to weigh
Yeah,
in?
It's fun to have people who get it because, as far as Zoe's point, there's a reason why a cellist or a songwriter or a musician telling people about how the economics of their lives work, there's a reason why that's so shocking to the vast majority of people. But part of it is that we in the West, going back to Homer, originally thought of the artist as a magician. So there's a sense that what an artist did, for most of us, it was something we couldn't do. So we thought there was some kind of magic to it. So I think there's still in the kind of Western soul this respect for music, but also, or for the arts, music, etc., but also a sense that it doesn't have anything to do with our lives and with sort of getting and spending and all the basic things of making your rent. But there's also a more tangible reason for that, which is that two of us on this panel are members of the press, and the press does a lot of things that keeps music and culture going, but we also tend to concentrate, it's become truer in the last decade or so, we concentrate on the most famous and most wealthy of musicians. So if you look at the New York Times, a great paper, but the artists they've put on the covers of the magazines have been huge, huge Kanye West story, for instance. Kanye West is a pretty good musician, but his story, his struggles, as I think the headline put it, are very different than the struggles of the vast majority of artists, musicians, songwriters, novelists, poets, et cetera, and that vast middle you mentioned are people we never hear about. So you hear about people at the very, very top. You hear about Taylor Swift's 5 mansions and her innovative ways of reaching out to her fans. You hear about Kanye, and then you hear nothing for the vast majority of people here, most of whom produce the important music or culture in any society. And then at the bottom, we've got this lingering memory of the, you mentioned the bartender, lingering memory of this sort of Parisian gutter, the artists who sort of pass out from too much absinthe, and the drug addicts, these people exist and always have, and a lot of great rock and roll musicians have fit that description. But the vast majority of good music, literature, film, et cetera, that come out of any society come from that middle that we're not hearing about. That's something that I tried to get at in my book by interviewing musicians and writers and so on, and it was the part that's gotten the most response because readers just said, wow, I had no idea that these people actually were middle class and needed to make a living.
Zoe?
I had two things that were just very practical examples of the result of speaking up. Number one thing was I had a meeting with D.A. Wallach from Spotify and somebody at the head of marketing quite a while ago. And we just discussed how my life works, like how I make a living. And at the end of the meeting, these are 2 separate meetings, both of them said independently of each other, maybe actually you shouldn't put all of your catalog on Spotify. Like that.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Maybe you shouldn't.
Maybe you should not put all of your catalog on Spotify. Maybe you should actually withhold some of it. Maybe that's actually not a bad business strategy for you. Because that was what I was doing. And that was just an example of how they hadn't considered that I existed. And they were kind of in disbelief that maybe there might be other artists like me, and I couldn't actually even prove that other than anecdotally, because no other artists had gone online to publish their earnings. So I was hoping more artists would do that. The second thing is that when I talk about my experience, often I'm talking about it because I want to be understood. That's often what artists do, we want to be understood. And my audience are the ones who listen to that mostly. And the result of that is that they're like, wow, Zoe doesn't make any money from streaming. She actually makes all of her money from CD sales and from donations and from licensing and composing. And so they started just buying my music. They started as a way to say, like, hey, we like what she does. We'd like her to keep doing it. Let's help her out. And in this last year, as my husband was ill, and he just passed away from cancer, and as he was ill, the thing that allowed me to pay my medical bills was donations from my audience, because they know how my world works because I've been talking about it. So I think that that's just, I'm just one individual, but I think we just need more artists to, nobody's gonna attack you for being yourself. I think that's what artists are afraid of, is afraid of being attacked for speaking out, or, you know, but just be yourself and say what your experience is, that's all.
Maybe I can just sort of tie two things together here and ask you, you know, we're talking about this middle ground here between the starving artist and the superstar. And one of the things I talk about a lot in book publishing is that we're becoming a culture of bestsellers. And so you have Stephen King, you have J.K. Rowling, so those are the authors people hear about. And then you have that woman who self-published something about vampires online and became a bestseller. And so you have this group of people who are hopeful and are willing always to continue trying that. And the area that's getting screwed is what is known in publishing as the mid-list. And so that's a direct, you know, comparison to the music industry. I think you have the same phenomena. So one of the things I wanted to ask you all was sort of, what do you predict for the future? Because I find it very hard to tell people, especially younger people, you know, we're not going to produce quality content if we keep attacking the group in the middle, because just as you're saying, that's who's produced it. So I wondered if you could sort of give a bit of a prediction there and talk about how we can speak about that and whether there really is a threat to content and the quality of content.
The prediction is we're going to win everything. But seriously, the prediction is we're going to win everything. And people do ask me, where do you see your advocacy going? Like, Blake, what are you going to, you know, where do you see this all going? And I tell them and I'm dead serious. I see my advocacy ending, because I do see us winning every one of these fights. And the thing that has, the utter change that we experienced for the last 2 years is that with everyone getting involved, you're not going to get attacked for who you are and if you speak up on your own. There's no answer to that. And any social change, you know, Gloria Steinem tweeted, artist rights are human rights. I respect music. You know, it's okay to say that this is a human rights issue. It's okay to say that this is my profession. I have a right to do what I do. It's okay to say that without copyright, I have no rights. It's really okay. It's okay to say I make art. It's not snooty or snobbish. It's actually what I do. It's just an accurate description of my profession. It doesn't take anything away from anybody else. It's not on a pedestal. It's just what I do. So the fact that this has changed, you know, I'm not just optimistic. I do believe that we're going to get this right. And I think that we're in a period of incredible wrong. But again, you can wring your hands or you can roll up your sleeves, and you can't do both at the same time. I think what's changed is the very first thing that we do need, which is that everybody is really rolling up their sleeves now with an understanding about that middle class, that something is profoundly wrong, and that the people who make music and make art in general, whether it's writing, you know, whether it's books or painting, this is an incredibly valuable part of our society, and we don't want it to be lost. And it's really been we're facing an utter loss. So I do actually, my prediction is that this year coming up is gonna make last year look like small potatoes, and the year after that as well. This is a groundswell, and there's momentum now in a way that I don't think, that I for one have never seen. So I do think that there's a lot of optimism in the midst, again, of the hashtag that I came up earlier.
Scott, were you gonna?
Boy, well, so allow me to be the, I'll allow Zoe to be the voice of reason. I'll be the pessimistic side. So I hope everything Blake said comes true, and maybe it will. Let me just say what I think will happen if we keep on this course. And you're exactly right that the plight of the mid-list in fiction and book publishing, the middle-yielding musician, this is really the story of culture that matters. It's the one we don't hear anything about, but it really is the heart of the matter. So there are economic and technological reasons why the middle is being hollowed out while the bottom and top sort of stay where they are. It's complicated, but we don't have a culture if we don't have that middle. I mean, if all we have in music, say, is Taylor Swift and Beyonce and a few other superstars, if all we have is Stephen King and so on, we really don't have a culture. I mean, the people I'm writing my book for are not just, the reason that we're in trouble is because it's people in the middle. It's artists. We're in Canada, so I'll mention it's artists like Ron Sexsmith, who I think played here last week. It's people like Amy Mann in Los Angeles, where I live. It's Sloan, Joe Pernice, who's an American who moved to Canada because of medical insurance and runs the band, the Pernice Brothers. It's people who a lot of us haven't heard of. I could list poets and filmmakers and so on who most people haven't heard of either. That's really where the culture happens, and that's the stuff that inspires people at all levels. So the fact that that's being hollowed out is a problem. I'll connect it to the middle class, though. People with trust funds will continue to make art. I mean, if you are independently wealthy, you can do whatever you want, including, and Taylor Swift's father was a bank president, as was his father. They moved to Nashville so that she could have a career in country music. If you are really, really wealthy, you can make films. You can compose classical music, paint for a living, etc. The problem is, if you want to make a career at it, it's become much tougher. So it comes down to me, it comes down to artists getting paid. If we had a serene, perfect socialism where people were able to feed and clothe themselves based on being a citizen of this utopian nation, it would be different. My biggest fear is that this destroying of the middle will continue. Mid-list writers, mid-level musicians, the larger middle class. I guess my biggest overall thought on this is when artists and craftsmen don't get paid, we all pay the price. Whether you're a musician yourself, a novelist yourself, doesn't really matter. Those people are being hit most acutely. But I mean the broad audience of readers, listeners, viewers of film, museum goers, we depend on psychologically, culturally, the work these people produce. We depend on the class that gets it out to the rest of us. And when they're imperiled, we all suffer for it. I hope that we're at the end of this process, and I hope that we're at the kind of dark end of a transition you're talking about, and that we're moving forward. But to me, that's what the stakes are.
Sorry, you want to add something?
Well, I mean, I sure wish I could predict the future, because there's a lot of stock I would have bought, and I'd be rich by now. I can't predict the future, but I do think, however, that there are some things that I am still an optimist. And I believe that, just like money flows towards the path of least resistance, I also think that art always finds a way to get out. And that that will always be the case. So I don't think that there will ever be a decrease in art. And I do actually think that there is sort of the same amount of money, and it's just flowing towards different people right now. The money was taken out of the music industry and given to Google or Spotify. It's just like it's being pushed around. And there is, again, this idea of artists being able to use the tools that dismantled the industry to tell their story in a way that they never could before. So that some of that money could be directed back towards them directly. It seems just sort of another big shuffle. And at the same time, the music industry is just reflecting what's happening in culture at large, where we're getting a big, huge gap between the top and the bottom. So that might be a self-correcting thing over time. I don't know.
So we're about to go to questions, but just before we do, let me just ask you that notion that the money needs to be redistributed. The money is going in the wrong directions. What's the solution? Dare I say regulation?
The solution is paying artists for their, I was about to curse again, for their work. It's really, again, I often, it's amazing how fast the tall weeds grow in these discussions. And it really isn't any, you know, the machinations of how that happens may be a little more complicated. I said this to the General Counsel of the Copyright Office, and I said, listen, the machinations of international copyright law might be really complicated, but the reality is what we're talking about is really simple. And she said, okay, that's really interesting. What do you mean? I said, it means that I need to be paid when my work is used. It's really, you know, so we can figure out how would you like to do that, but that's what actually needs to happen. So of course that's what needs to happen, and I don't think that that does happen until people value that work in an inherent way as part of a valuable society. And you know, again, it's sort of, I think there was this idea like, Blake, why should you be paid for the job you don't really have? You don't really have a job. You wake up at 1 in the afternoon, and then you know, you have some absinthe, and then you take a nap, and you come up with a melody. You know, hell with you. You want to get paid. And that's something else that I think has really changed, which is that people understand that artists work just like everybody else works, and it's really okay. You know, I think I've even felt it with myself. Where was I 3 years ago about this discussion? I cared about it, but I really wasn't doing anything about it. And then one day I wrote Tim Westergren back for whatever reason. I don't even know why I did that. So, you know, stepping up is the most important thing, but what's the solution? The solution is starting from a place. This might be the top-down part, which is let's start with a place where the people who actually make music and art, we have to get them paid. So now let's figure out how we're going to do that, as opposed to having a discussion whether it's even worth getting them paid or they deserve to get paid, which has been the discussion. That's what happened with Lars Ulrich. Why should he even get paid? That's something that is changing. We're not there yet, but it's fundamentally changing. So that's, to me, that's what has to happen.
I think two basic things. One, I do think yes, some regulation. I think that's been true in nearly every other industry. It's like unions stop companies from taking advantage of workers, and all that stuff had to be hashed out in the beginning. Like the 8-hour workday is not something that a company came up with. It had to be like created. So there is some regulation, but then the other thing is that this idea that we still need a mechanism to keep track of things. It's still the case that, like, you know, I was saying earlier this morning, I give you a bottle of water. I don't have a bottle of water. Now you have one. I give you a digital bottle of water. Then you can, there's like as many in an infinite number. And there is a solution to this, and you know, I really starting to think along the path of like Bitcoin and blockchain, a way to keep track of pieces of copyright so that they can always be cascaded down into things. So that then you could create a way for users, fans, to maybe create things, but the credits to still go back to the person who created it and the person who owns it. So thinking about, like, we need more mechanisms to allow this new ecosystem to exist in a way that does compensate the people who create stuff. So,
Scott?
Well, those are excellent points. I mean, let me jump from one of those. When a similarly disruptive force came into Western life in the 1760s, 70s in Manchester and elsewhere, industry, factories, industrial capitalism, a lot of good things happened, but we also had child labor, we had rivers and fields being polluted, we had villages wiped out, cities became basically prison camps because workers were coming from the countryside to work in these factories. There were good things that came because of industrialism and capitalism, but there was also a movement toward regulation and humanizing this movement. Because of it, we have, as Blake just mentioned, weekends. You can no longer put a 12-year-old at work at a factory in the Western world, at least. And we need a similar revolution in technology and towards Silicon Valley. We cannot just open the doors and say, take whatever you want, take artists' work, take photographers' work, take journalists' work. Regulation is some communist plot, do what you want. Similarly, if we're talking about Silicon Valley, and this crisis we're talking about is more than just digital technology, but Silicon Valley tech companies are a big part of the problem. These people will yell and scream if there's any regulation put on the internet. The fact is, though, the internet didn't develop because of the magic of the marketplace and because of the genius of these 25-year-old Stanford grads living in south of Market. The internet was developed very heavily because of my parents' and your parents' taxes. It was a publicly funded thing developed through the Department of Defense, basic research, laboratories all over the country, tax-free institutions like Stanford. the internet was made by you and me and our taxes. So for it to pivot to being run by libertarians who think, whose goal is to shred the safety net and to tell musicians, artists, middle-class people that they have too much and they need to shift all the wealth up to the tech sector, it's just crazy. So I think for people to become more aware of the way the internet and Silicon Valley work, to understand the fact that this technology is not something that they came up with, that they can just run off with. The technology is something that belongs to all of us, and we have to find a way to use it so that it helps the broad range of people and not just the captains of industry.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all three. I like Blake's line that we're halfway there. We're winning the public relations war. I think we have time for a few questions from the floor, if there are mics out there. Any questions? There's one here.
Thank you. Why do you think music is valued so little, and art in general? But was it because of the digitalization? So I came from the music world background, managing artists, being an artist myself, found that the only people who were willing to pay us were advertising agencies and television. So created a community, company called Music Dealers, just earned our artists over $15 million directly in their pocket, all independent. But we're still up against every single day, hey, we spent so much on this beautiful commercial, can you just do the music for free? And you would never say, I spent so much on this beautiful house, can you just paint it for free? And so why is it with music that people just don't value it? And it's the afterthought, and they're like, yeah, it's free, it's out there. Why is that?
I think, the Dire Straits song, your money's for nothing and your chick's for free. That's still in the zeitgeist, it's still in the bloodstream. And I think, and I do think that that's changing a little bit because the middle is standing up. So we've been taught this idea. We've been taught the Beyonce versus the bartender mythology. So, and that then feeds several forms of disrespect. The first is, what do I care if Beyonce is not getting the money she deserves? She's got enough money, I have a real job, okay? The second is, why should I pay for you? You're a bartender. Why should I pay for your music? If you were any good, you'd be Beyonce. Okay? So that's how that works. And you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But the thing I think that can change that, and I think Scott just said the magic word before, it's movement. It's that we've seen social change come through movements again and again and again and again. And what I've seen over the last year is a combination of our organizations as musicians standing up for us, our legislators listening to people. It's not just a feel-good optimism that I have. Our regulation and legislation, the Fair Play, Fair Pay Act will fundamentally change the lives of millions of American musicians. It'll change music around the world too, because the United States is essentially living under a trade embargo when it comes to radio royalties, because other companies aren't paying artists. An artist that I work with all the time, her name is Janata. She's my label mate, and her story is amazing. She is a Finnish artist who started as a child star, and so she didn't write a lot of her songs, but a lot of her income came from radio royalties. She came to the United States and got a record deal here, noticed that she didn't get radio royalties in the United States, and thought that was weird, but maybe that's because Finland is progressive and they do cool things. She actually discovered the United States was alone in this regard. She's grown up, she's an amazing artist, and she decided to become an American citizen last year. When she became an American citizen, she lost all of her radio royalties. And when you tell that story on Capitol Hill, for all of my shindig, that's the moment that the representatives sit up and go, wait a second. She came to the home of the free and the land of the brave and the land of opportunity, and she lost, right? So there's a fundamental disconnect, and the internet is a huge part of it, but terrestrial radio, for me, is perhaps the oldest and most egregious form of disrespect. So it's systemic, and the way that it changes, in my opinion, is through this movement that actually demands change from our legislators, demands change from our thinking, so that we don't just imagine the bartender, by the way, who might be a great musician, and Beyonce, who I actually think is pretty awesome. So, changing that perception, at least when I try to think about these kinds of changes in other areas of our society, they've come through a change of perception. Wow, women should have the right to vote, right? Because they're people, and but they're not going to get the right to vote until you win the hearts and minds of the people, saying, okay, that actually should happen. So I think you're right, and that's been the most painful disconnect to watch as an artist for me. But I think that's, a revolution without optimism is a revolution not worth having. So that's why I'm optimistic, because I think we're changing.
Scott, you want to add something?
Yeah, your question is really important, and I wish I could answer it, but there are two things. I've been trying to write for a few months a piece. All I have is the headline, but it would be called something like "Losing Our Religion," and the subhead is something like, "How did culture turn into content? It wasn't just technology. Something happened to our souls first." So there's a transition we went through as a culture, the sort of English-speaking world. I think the problem we're talking about isn't as acute in continental Europe and some other places. There are cultures like India that have a deeper relationship to music and culture. But in the sort of capitalist, English-speaking West, we've very much lost our sense that there's something noble, sacred, important about music and other kinds of culture. I don't mean those of us in this room, but what's important about your question is that it's not just what happens in Washington or people like us who are inside the culture business. It's the kind of it's the understanding or misunderstanding that the broader audience has. I wish I could answer it, but what you're describing is absolutely real. It's one of the bases of the problem. And I remember, a lot of us remember buying vinyl records, right? Or in my case, I was an hour from a big city, so to buy a Velvet Underground record or a Billy Bragg record or something, I had to drive an hour to a Tower Records, speaking of things that have disappeared in recent memory, but I had to drive an hour to a Tower Records to go to an import bin or to, find unusual stuff. To see a jazz show, I would have to do the same thing in most of the places I've lived. And it was, in a way, the distance that these kinds of culture had, that you had to fight for them. You had to maybe get friends who would go with you, or there was a kind of pilgrimage aspect to culture in the pre-digital age. And it made it harder to get to, but there was a kind of passion that generated, that it was worth fighting for. And that's something that we've lost. It's not just technology, but it's a very profound thing. I'm glad you asked that question.
So familiarity breeds contempt. So, sorry, do you want to add something before we go to another question?
I just wanted to say really quickly that there's also just a big demographics thing going on where there's more people, who are 20 years old and younger. This is a huge group of people who are bigger than the baby boomers. And what do young people do? They make stuff. They make music. And so it does seem, if you're making a film, you're like, well, heck, look at all this music. It's all the same, right? It doesn't seem that valuable because there's just a lot of it. And I know that musicians, we all think that we're all unique and special flowers, but there are a lot of other artists. And so what I've say often is that at one point in my career, I just decided that some things I was going to choose who gets to have my music for free. So if I really like your project, I'll let you have it. But then I just set a threshold, and my agent won't give it away for less than a certain amount of money. And then it became worth that amount of money. So just, you can say how much it's worth if you want to.
Are there questions out there on
My name is Hilly, and I'm a songwriter, and I live in the UK. And I think that it is, yes, there are a lot of positive things happening, and people are starting to listen. But then you turn around and you see the EU turn around and say, yeah, we want to, of course artists and musicians should get paid. But then they write up a new proposal for copyright that doesn't protect any of us, and broadens fair use. I'd like to hear your view on the fair use, and then you listen to the Pandora verdict that just came. It seems like we're actually, going backwards when it comes to legislation.
I definitely don't think we're going backwards when it comes to legislation. But, it's okay to have, it's okay to have setbacks along the way, and those, you just named two that have really upset me. But, yeah, and I'm with you, and I guess all I'm saying is, again, I'm able to have two emotions at the same time. I'm able to be really pissed and really righteously angry about those, and also be ready to get to work and get ready to change this. Hopelessness is our greatest enemy, I think. And when we can tap into anger and raising our voices, it really does change those things. So there are far many more victories over the last year or so than there are the two setbacks that you've talked about. So we simply have to double down and make sure that we don't have more of those, and also to rectify this. We clearly haven't convinced all the people that we have to convince. Maybe we've only just started, right? But the only way that we're going to, you know, in the US, the Supreme Court is about to rule on marriage equality. And there's a lot of talk about whether or not they're going to come down in favor of marriage equality or against it. But the thinking is, the public is so in favor of marriage equality in the United States. Now, how are they ever going to rule against this and be on the wrong side of history? So one of the ways that I try to couch those kinds of setbacks is, well, they're on the wrong side of history. And we have to make sure that they're embarrassed on coming down. They're the ones who are actually looking backwards. We're the ones who are actually looking forward. So I'm pissed about them, but I'm not dispirited.
I think we have time for one more question before we go to our breakout sessions. Oh, sorry.
Hi, is that on? Hello. Just a couple quick questions, because I'm really just learning a lot about this stuff. In the US and in the UK, do they have like an organization like SOCAN up here in Canada that can kind of police some of this stuff? And two, is there anything like a digital copyright that can somehow be placed in so that if anybody does try to just turn around and lift it, like in some way they just can't do it?
Yeah, it's called copyright.
Just copyright.
But I think, Zoe, you were talking about that earlier, some kind of watermark or something.
Yeah, digital watermarking is not what I was thinking of, but I was thinking more of a way that you could track copyrights by them being unique. But there are no central initiatives. I've had my toes in a few of them from the World Economic Forum and some other entities that Google is involved in and stuff, but none of them are really going anywhere because there hasn't been an economic incentive for anybody to do that. There was some talk for a while about having a universal database, like a copyright database. That's not the answer either. But that's really, I think that's where my brain is. You know, and I'm really hoping that other people go there too. So.
I think that kind of real nitty-gritty stuff, that's exactly, I think, what our breakout sessions are for. So I think maybe we should move to that now. So everyone has a facilitator at the table. We have about 20-25 minutes to discuss the 7 options you're going to be given to address the issues we've raised here and rank them in order of importance. And I remind you again, of course, of the Chatham House rule that as of this moment, we're now kind of off the record. No names and no affiliations. So thank you very much. The room. But so please do fill out those questionnaires before you leave. Before we finish, I wanted to thank our 3 wonderful panelists, Blake Morgan, Scott Timberg, and Zoë Keating, for really getting a very vigorous debate going on these issues. Thank you very much to our table facilitators who have led the breakout sessions. And to Music Canada for supporting this session, and also for all of you for sharing your views. So thanks to everybody. And please do fill out the questionnaires. Thanks.
Folks, if I could just have your attention for just a few seconds to kind of wrap up. Music Canada has been sponsoring this event. If I could just have your attention, folks. Music Canada has now been doing this for about 10 years. And in those 10 years, we've had absolutely splendid speakers. Those that we had today were definitely in that tradition. But I just thought it might be worth reminding those longtime attendees and those who hadn't of some of the people that have been here. They've all contributed in one way or another to a narrative. For example, Deborah Spar. Deborah Spar wrote a book called Ruling the Waves, which examined what happens when a technological disruption impacts an industry and industries. It's a book that is very worth reading still to this day, Ruling the Waves. Robert Levine spoke here, his book, Free Ride. Chris Ruin was here, I think 2 years ago, Freeloading. And Jaron Lanier, whose book, You Are Not a Gadget, he spoke here, I think about 5 years ago. What a terrific, these are all books worth reading. David Lowery was here. And if there's a theme, and I think we heard a little bit of it today, it's nobody thinks technology is inherently evil. It's what we do with it that matters. It should not be a playground for the libertarian rich. It does not have to be a completely unregulated environment. And I think, for example, of what Francis Gurry said to me, who is the head of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and he looked back on the past 15 years and he said that what has happened to creators was entirely avoidable. Avoidable. Now, I'll just add one last thing about the role of artists, because historically, and I'm so glad to get the shout out from Scott to Homer, loved it. But all artists have messages, things that they're trying to tell us. And Homer, well, he was basically telling the Greek civilization they needed to grow up and stop being so goddamn selfish. If you think about all of those characters in the Iliad, they're all making decisions for themselves, about themselves, and they're guided by an ungovernable pride. That describes a little bit to me our own modern dilemma. And the other poets and artists that I'll just point to briefly is Percy Bysshe Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley, two poets that are very close and writers that are very close to me. Both of them thought very carefully about technology. One might not think that, but Frankenstein, perhaps one of the most famous books ever written. What is that book about? I think that book is about the unmediated introduction of technology and science into society without thinking about it, without pausing and saying, what is this doing to us? Who's benefiting? Why should we let this happen? And Mary, for her part, well, she suggested that we get monsters when we do that. And her husband wrote a book called Prometheus, a poem called Prometheus, and bound roughly contemporaneously. The two of them worked very closely together on so many different things. But he too talked an awful lot about what happens. He called his book about Prometheus. Prometheus, as we remember, gave fire and technology to mankind. But what he said about the fire, the Promethean fire, was it was most terrible but lovely. So it's not inherently evil. It's what we do with it. It's how we harness it. And our society will be judged by the way it is harnessed for the benefit of us all, not just a tiny elite group. One last author I want to leave. She's not here. I would love to have her come and speak. If anybody can convince Astra Taylor. Astra Taylor, we want you. Good. Astra Taylor is another Canadian. Yes, she is, another Canadian documentary filmmaker. Her book is called The People's Platform. And if there's one book other than Scott's book that you have to read, it would be that. So with that, thank you so much for being part of this process. Thank you so much for giving up all of your time and mental energy on a Friday morning in the middle of Canadian Music Week. Have a great one.